You hold your phone or your tablet in your hands, or maybe you're just listening to the sound of my voice in the dark, and you feel like you have a handle on what money is. You understand that the numbers on your screen represent value, that a credit card is a promise, and that the coins in your pocket are, well, just metal. Now, what if I told you there was a form of money, the oldest money in the world, that defied all of that? A currency so strange that its value wasn't in its metal or its paper or even in its digital code, but in something you can't see, something that existed entirely in the minds of the people who used it. Imagine a world where a giant rock, a stone so large it could take a team of people to move it, was your money. And what if that stone, that huge, unwieldy piece of wealth, sat at the bottom of the ocean or in the jungle, never moving from its spot? And yet, it was still being used to buy and sell things. What if a person could own that giant stone, could use it to purchase land or pay a dowry, even though they had never once laid a hand on it? Welcome to the story of the rice stones of Yap, the most fascinating and baffling currency in all of human history, a story of an ancient mystery that feels as shocking today as it did hundreds of years ago. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. The history of the rice stones begins not with a known date or a specific inventor, but in the hazy mists of Yapes oral tradition, where the line between myth and documented fact is beautifully and maybe a little sleepily blurred. We find ourselves on Yap, an island of the Federated States of Micronesia, a place where for generations the people used these enormous donut-shaped stones as their primary form of currency. These aren't just any stones. These are massive, heavy discs of limestone and aragonite, with a hole carved through the center. Some are small enough for a person to carry, but the most valuable ones are colossal, reaching up to 12 feet in diameter and weighing 4 metric tons or more. Just imagine trying to carry one of those. You wouldn't even try. It's a completely different kind of thinking about value, about portability, about what makes something money. Mainstream historical fact tells us that the rice stones were quarried not on Yap itself, which lacked the necessary geological formations, but on the distant island of Palau, over 250 miles away. Now, this is the first of many profound mysteries. How did they even know that Palau had this specific type of rock? There is no written record of this discovery, no blueprint or map. The knowledge, like the ownership of the stones, was passed down orally, from elder to apprentice, from generation to generation, woven into the fabric of their legends. The Yapese people were master navigators, a mainstream historical fact that is well documented. But the question of how this initial geological survey was conducted remains an open historiographic mystery. Did a Yapese adventurer, perhaps one named Anakumag, stumble upon the Aragonite caves of Palau by accident? Or was it a deliberate and meticulously planned expedition? We don't know for sure, but the mainstream historical fact is that they did find them and that they began a process that would become the central pillar of their economy. One hypothesis, perhaps a bit romanticized, but entirely plausible, is that the journey to find this special rock was itself a rite of passage, a test of faith and endurance that proved one's worthiness to the community. They weren't just searching for money, they were searching for meaning, for a substance that could hold the collective effort and risk of a whole society. A material that had a built in backstory. And what a story each stone holds. Think about your own money for a moment. A $20 bill has a picture of Andrew Jackson on it, but its real story is just a transaction, an impersonal exchange. For the Yapis, every rice stone was a living legend. Its worth was not just in its size, but in the number of lives it cost to create and transport. The specific voyage, the storms weathered, the conflicts overcome. One stone might be worth more than a larger one simply because its journey was more perilous. A fact known and agreed upon by the entire community. It was a currency of narrative, a history of human endeavor carved into a giant rock. The stones were not just objects, they were stories, and the stories were their value. It's a concept that feels almost alien to us, so tethered to our spreadsheets and stock tickers. For the APs, wealth wasn't an abstraction, it was a tangible reminder of their collective past. This idea that the value of an object is tied directly to the narrative of its creation is so profoundly different from our modern conception of money that it forces us to re-examine what we truly value. Is it the thing itself, or is it the story behind the thing? The narrative of Yapis Hirai is not just about the stones themselves, but about the audacious, almost unbelievable journeys taken to acquire them. Imagine, if you can, a small wooden outrigger canoe, perhaps 20 feet long, with a few men paddling and sailing, setting out on a voyage over 250 miles of open ocean. They weren't just going fishing, they were on a mission to bring back a new piece of their economy, a mission that was as much a spiritual pilgrimage as a commercial venture. This perilous generations-old quest to Palau is a mainstream historical fact, a central pillar of the Rai economy. Yet, the exact methods and navigational secrets they used to traverse such vast open waters remain an open historiographic mystery. How did they find their way with such precision, without a compass or modern charts, over a featureless expanse of water? Mainstream historical fact tells us that the APs, like many Pacific Islanders, were master navigators, but the specific details of their celestial and oceanic knowledge are a closely guarded secret, passed down only to a select few. One hypothesis, and a very compelling one, is that they used a sophisticated system of star compasses and wave patterns. They could read the ocean, understanding the subtle swells and currents that indicated the presence of distant land. They would track the flight paths of certain seabirds, which would lead them toward unseen islands. The journey was not just a physical one. It was a mental and spiritual exercise, a test of a navigator's deep, almost innate connection to the natural world. The voyagers would go into a trance-like state, feeling the rhythm of the waves, listening to the subtle changes in the wind, and trusting their senses in a way we've largely forgotten. It was an undertaking that demanded not just courage, but an almost supernatural level of skill and faith. They were not just sailing, they were communing with the ocean itself. And when they finally reached the shores of Palau, they would enter a new phase of the quest, the physical labor of extracting the stone. Quarrying the rice stones was an immense, back-breaking undertaking, made even more difficult by the primitive tools they used for centuries. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the Yapis used stone and shell tools to hack and chip away at the solid limestone formations in the Palawan caves. Imagine the sound of it, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of stone on stone, echoing in the dark, humid caves. It was a slow, arduous process that could take months, if not years, for a single large stone. The tools would break, and the men would sweat, and the sheer effort of it was a testament to their dedication. But why? Why go through all this trouble for a rock? A mainstream historical fact is that this immense effort was not seen as a chore, but as an integral part of the stone's value. The blood, sweat, and tears of its creation were its soul, its unique history. The value of the stone was not inherent in the material itself, but in the human labor and suffering embedded within it. This is a crucial point, an economic principle that feels strangely modern. It's like a piece of art whose value is tied not just to its beauty, but to the artist's struggle and passion. The more difficult the quarrying, the more valuable the stone became. It was a physical manifestation of their social contract, a silent promise to the community that they were willing to endure for the collective good. The true marvel, however, was getting the stones back to Yap. Once a stone was quarried and shaped into its distinctive disc, it had to be loaded onto a raft, often a fragile-looking bamboo platform, and towed back across the open ocean. This was the most dangerous part of the entire process. A mainstream historical fact is that many of these voyages were lost at sea, their crews and their precious cargo swallowed by the vast indifferent Pacific. The loss of a single stone was a tragedy, not just for the crew, but for the entire community. It was a loss of potential wealth, a loss of the story that had yet to be completed. An open historiographic mystery, though, is how they managed to secure the stones to these simple rafts without them shifting or sinking. There's no detailed manual, no blueprint for this feat of engineering. One hypothesis is that they used a complex system of woven ropes and buoyancy aids, a method so effective and so reliant on expert knowledge that it was never written down, only ever shown. Imagine that. A technology so sophisticated that its very existence was a form of intellectual property, a secret that made the entire system work. The men who returned from these voyages were not just traders, they were heroes, their reputations elevated by the sheer risk they had undertaken. They were the brave souls who went into the unknown and returned with wealth, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Their stories, the details of the storms they faced, and the close calls they had, would become part of the stone's narrative, a whispered history that made the Rai all the more valuable. It was a perfect system, a self-sustaining economy of effort, risk, and storytelling. It made you question what was truly valuable. Was it the stone, or was it the story of the stone? The answer, for the Yapis, was both, inextricably linked, like a single thread woven into a beautiful, complicated tapestry. And as they dragged these new stones ashore, sometimes with the help of the entire village, their shared history grew. One giant silent currency at a time. The world's oldest money was not a transaction. It was a testament. It was a memory. Once the rice stones were successfully quarried and survived the treacherous sea voyage back to Yap, their journey was still not complete. The most difficult part of the process, a feat of logistics and brute force, still lay ahead. moving the gigantic stones from the shoreline to their final resting place, often in the center of the village. This incredible effort is a mainstream historical fact, witnessed and documented by early European visitors who were astounded by the Yapese people's ability to coordinate such a monumental task. The stones, some of which weighed as much as an elephant, had to be moved with nothing more than sheer human strength, leveraging, and ingenuity. It was a communal endeavor that involved every able bodied person in the village, a testament to their social cohesion and shared purpose. Yet the exact methods used to move these gargantuan objects with such primitive technology remain a fascinating open historiographic mystery. How did they roll, slide, and lift these massive, unwieldy discs without the aid of modern machinery or even beasts of burden? We know they didn't have wheels as we know them. One leading hypothesis is that they used a system of coconut log rollers and levers, similar to those believed to have been used to construct ancient monuments like Stonehenge or the pyramids. The logs would be placed beneath the stone, and teams of men, women, and children would pull on thick woven ropes, slowly inching the stone forward. The process would be accompanied by rhythmic chants and songs, a form of communal coordination that not only kept their movements in sync, but also served as a morale booster. Imagine the scene: the whole village, a living, breathing engine, working in unison, their voices echoing through the tropical air. Each movement, each heave and pull, was a slow, deliberate act of communal will. But beyond the sheer physics of it, there was a deeper, more spiritual dimension to this process. The movement of the stone was not just a physical act, it was a ritual, a ceremonial procession that imbued the stone with even more value. As it moved from the wildness of the shoreline to the heart of the village, it was transformed from a simple rock into a sanctified object of wealth, a tangible representation of their shared labor and history. It was as if they were literally dragging their collective future into the present. The rice stone's value was directly proportional to the effort invested in its acquisition and transport. A mainstream historical fact is that a stone that had been successfully brought back from Palau, a stone that had survived the journey, was considered more valuable than one found closer to home. Its story, its narrative of struggle and triumph, was its most important feature. The holes carved in the center of the stones, a mainstream historical fact, were not just for aesthetics. They were for practicality, a way to thread a log through the middle so the stone could be carried or moved more easily. But even this simple feature has an open historiographic mystery associated with it. Why were some holes perfectly round and smooth, while others were rough and jagged? One hypothesis is that the quality of the carving in the hole was a mark of the craftsman's skill, and a perfectly smooth hole would have added a premium to the stone's value, signaling not just effort, but artistry. It was a kind of ancient quality control, a subtle way to show off the superior craftsmanship that went into a particular piece of currency. It's a bit like a modern banknote with special security features or a rare artistically designed coin. The little details matter. This entire process, from quarrying to transport to placement, was a public spectacle, a collective reaffirmation of the community's values. Everyone knew the story of each stone, its size, who brought it back, and what it cost. This is the central defining feature of the Yapese economy: transparency. The mainstream historical fact is that Ownership was not private, it was a public trust, known and validated by the entire community. When a stone changed hands for a marriage dowry, a land transaction, or to settle a conflict, the stone itself might not move at all. An open historiographic mystery is how they managed to maintain such perfect records of ownership without any form of writing. A hypothesis, and a beautiful one, is that the entire history of the rice stones was memorized, passed down in the form of epic poems and songs, a living ledger that was sung, not written. The community itself was the blockchain, a decentralized and completely trusted system of record keeping. They didn't need a central bank or a ledger. They had each other and their collective memory. It was an economy built on trust, and the stones were simply the physical manifestation of that trust, a tangible, but not necessary, reminder of a shared promise. The immense labor required to quarry and transport the rice stones from Palau to Yap was not merely a physical act, it was a deeply social and communal one. Mainstream historical fact confirms that these expeditions were organized and sanctioned by the village chiefs, and the effort involved a significant portion of the community. Think of it less as a business trip and more as a national project, a kind of ancient infrastructure build. The men who sailed the canoes and quarried the stone were not just workers. They were representing their entire village, and their success or failure directly impacted the wealth and status of everyone back home. The immense effort required was in itself the source of the stone's value. There was no shortcut, no way to acquire a rice stone without this tremendous collective investment of time, energy, and risk. It's an economy built not on scarcity of material, but on the difficulty of its acquisition. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact system of social organization and hierarchy that governed these expeditions. Was the leadership based on merit, lineage, or a combination of both? One hypothesis is that the voyage leaders were chosen based on their proven navigational skills and their spiritual connection to the sea. The success of the journey was believed to be a reflection of the leader's favor with the ancestors and ocean spirits. This made the act of leadership not just a practical role, but a spiritual one, further embedding the rice stones in the cultural and religious fabric of Yapese society. The community had to have complete faith in their leader, trusting him with their lives and their future wealth. The entire system rested on a foundation of trust and shared purpose. Imagine the pressure on that leader, knowing that the well-being of his entire village rested on his ability to read the stars and the waves. The very act of organizing the expedition was a test of his worthiness, a public display of his commitment to the collective good. This communal effort extended beyond the sea voyage. Once a stone was brought back to Yap's shoreline, a massive land-based effort was required to move it to its final destination. This, a mainstream historical fact, an event so significant it would draw out the entire community. It was a time for celebration, for feasting, and for reinforcing social bonds. The village elders would supervise, the men would pull the ropes, and the women and children would assist in any way they could, perhaps by clearing the path or offering food and water to the workers. It was a moment of profound unity, a shared experience that bonded the people together. The stone itself became a physical symbol of this shared experience. a public monument to their collective strength and resilience. The bigger the stone, the more grand the celebration, and the more prestige it brought to the village. The stone's value was not just in its use as a currency, it was in its ability to bring people together, to create a shared narrative of triumph. An open historiographic mystery surrounds the specific ceremonies and rituals that accompanied the moving of these stones. While we know that feasts and celebrations were a part of it, the intricate details of the specific chants, dances, and offerings remain largely unrecorded in Western historical accounts. A hypothesis is that these rituals were designed to honor the ancestors and spirits of the land and sea, ensuring their favor for future expeditions and the continued prosperity of the village. The act of moving the stone was a form of communication with the spiritual world, a way of showing gratitude for the safe return of the voyagers and the successful acquisition of a new piece of wealth. It was a dialogue between the physical and spiritual realms, a testament to the belief that their world was not just made of rock and water, but of unseen forces that had to be appeased and honored. The rice stone was a currency of social organization. Its existence necessitated a complex system of leadership, cooperation, and communal labor. The value of the stone was not determined by its size alone, but by the story of its creation, which was a story of collective effort. A mainstream historical fact is that a stone that had been successfully acquired and transported with great difficulty was worth far more than a larger stone that was found to be easier to obtain. This means that a smaller rice stone, perhaps one that was brought back during a particularly violent storm, could be more valuable than a huge one brought back during calm seas. This is the ultimate example of a provenance economy, where the history and origin of an object are its most valuable attributes. The rice stones were a physical manifestation of Yepi's values: hard work, bravery, and community. They were not just a medium of exchange, they were a mirror, reflecting the best aspects of their society. They showed the world and each other what they were truly made of. The most astonishing and almost unbelievable aspect of the rice stone economy is the concept of its ownership, a system based entirely on oral tradition and collective memory, rather than physical possession. A mainstream historical fact is that once a rice stone was successfully moved to its final designated location in the village, it was rarely, if ever, moved again. It just sat there, in the open air, often partially overgrown with moss, a silent and immovable fixture of the landscape. And yet, this is where the magic and the incredible trust comes in. An open historiographic mystery is how the Yepes people maintained a flawless, decentralized record of every single transaction without a single scrap of paper, a single piece of writing, or any form of centralized ledger. The stone could be sitting on one family's land for decades, but everyone in the village, and indeed on the entire island, knew that it actually belonged to someone else. The value of the stone was not in its physical presence, but in the collective knowledge of its history and its ownership. When a rice stone changed hands, a mainstream historical fact is that the buyer and seller would simply announce the transaction to the community. They would stand in the presence of the stone, often with witnesses, and verbally transfer ownership. The story would be told again. This stone, which was used to buy the land over there, has now been used to pay for the dowry for this young woman. The new owner would then have to memorize this new piece of the stone's history. It's a bit like a living, breathing blockchain where the community itself acts as the distributed ledger. Everyone had a copy of the record, not in a book, but in their mind. A hypothesis is that this system worked because of the small, close-knit nature of Yepi society, where social pressure and the desire to maintain one's reputation were powerful forces. It would be impossible to cheat the system because everyone knew the truth. To lie about owning a stone or to claim a history that wasn't true would be to invite public shame and social ostracism, a punishment far worse than any fine or imprisonment. This system of intangible wealth meant that a family's fortune wasn't sitting in a vault. It was sitting in the minds of their neighbors. This created a level of social cohesion and mutual trust that is almost unimaginable in our modern world. Your wealth was only as good as your reputation. You couldn't just pick up your fortune and leave. Your wealth was literally tied to the community because they were the ones who validated it. This is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the fundamentally different way the Yapis viewed money. It wasn't a tool for individual accumulation, it was a tool for social connection. It was a promise, a contract, a debt, and a gift, all rolled into one. It was a physical representation of an intangible network of trust and obligation. The stone itself was just a symbol, a memory aid, a massive, unmoving token of a shared story. How disputes over ownership were settled. There must have been disagreements, times when memories differed, or when a younger generation had forgotten a piece of the stone's history. How did they resolve these conflicts? We have no written records of legal proceedings or formal arbitration. A hypothesis is that the elders of the village, with their deeper and more comprehensive knowledge of the stone's histories, would act as a kind of Supreme Court. Their collective memory and wisdom would be the final authority. It was a society where the past was literally part of the present, where history was not just something you learned from a book, but something that was a part of your daily life. The elders were the living repositories of this knowledge, and their word was law. It was a system that valued wisdom and age, a sharp contrast to our modern world, which often idolizes youth and disruption. This reliance on oral tradition meant that the rice stones were not just money, they were also a form of cultural heritage. Each stone was a physical record of a voyage, a marriage, a land deal, a conflict, or a truce. The entire history of Yepes society was, in a sense, etched into these stones, not with a chisel, but with a shared memory. The stories of the stones were passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, becoming a part of the Yepes identity. They were a link to the past, a connection to the ancestors who had braved the seas to bring them back. Even a stone that had sunk to the bottom of the ocean on its journey could still be considered a valuable piece of currency, as long as everyone knew its story. An open historiographic mystery is whether this ever happened, if a stone was lost at sea but still used for transactions. One hypothesis is that yes, this was possible, as long as the entire community was aware of the stone's story and its location. A stone sitting on a reef at the bottom of the Pacific could still be used to buy a piece of land, as long as everyone agreed that the transaction had taken place. It's an economic system that is almost spiritual in its trust and abstraction. The value was never in the object, it was in the shared understanding. Beyond their role as a simple medium of exchange, the rice stones were central to Yuppies' social and political life, acting as the ultimate status symbol and a tangible link in a network of alliances and obligations. A mainstream historical fact is that the largest and most impressive rice stones were not used for everyday transactions like buying food or tools. Instead, they were reserved for major ceremonial exchanges. Think of them less as cash and more as the crown jewels or the deed to the kingdom. They were the currency of power. When a village chief needed to demonstrate his wealth and influence, he would not move the rice stone, but he would publicly declare its use. The transaction would be a major public event, solidifying his status and reinforcing the social hierarchy. It was during these grand feasts and ceremonies that the rice stones truly came alive. However, is the precise nature of the ceremonies and the specific feasting protocols that surrounded these exchanges. While we know that feasts were a central part of the process, the intricate details of the specific foods served, the dances performed, and the ritualistic speeches given remain largely unrecorded in Western historical accounts. A hypothesis is that these ceremonies were not just celebrations, but a complex series of performative acts designed to validate the transaction and honor the ancestors. The feasting was a form of communal consumption, a shared experience that bonded the people together and made the transaction a part of their collective memory. The food and drink were not just sustenance, they were a form of currency themselves, a shared offering that sealed the deal. It was a multi-sensory experience where the wealth was not just seen, but tasted, heard, and felt. The rice stones were used for a variety of critical social purposes. Mainstream historical fact confirms that they were used for dowries, to settle land disputes, and to pay for alliances between different clans or villages. When a young man wanted to marry into a powerful family, a large rice stone, one with a prestigious history of its own, might be offered as a dowry. This was not just a payment, it was a public declaration of the man's family's wealth and standing. The rice stone served as a tangible link between the two families, a silent promise of future cooperation and mutual respect. The stone's history of struggle and success would become intertwined with the new family's narrative, making it a source of pride for generations. The stones were also used to settle feuds and prevent violence. An open historiographic mystery is how they managed to de-escalate armed conflicts with a simple transaction. A hypothesis is that the offering of a large rice stone was seen as an act of profound humility and a sincere desire for peace. The sheer effort and value of the stone made the offer impossible to refuse without a loss of face. The rice stone was a way to buy peace, a silent treaty that was far more enduring than any written contract because it was publicly known and validated by the entire community. It was a currency that could literally stop a war. The political power of the chiefs was directly tied to their control over the rice stones. Mainstream historical fact is that a chief's influence was not measured in how much he personally owned, but in how many he controlled, and how wisely he used them to benefit the community. A wise chief might use a rice stone to fund a new canoe building project or to help a family that had fallen on hard times. This would not only demonstrate his wealth, but also his generosity and leadership, earning him respect and loyalty. The stones were a tool for governance, a way to redistribute wealth and maintain social harmony. The fact that the stones were immobile and in public view meant that a chief's wealth was always on display, a constant reminder of his power and his responsibility. It was a system that encouraged generosity and discouraged hoarding, a sharp contrast to our modern capitalist system, which often rewards personal accumulation. The wealth was not in the stone itself, but in the social good it could generate. It was a system that put community above the individual, and it worked beautifully for centuries, right up until the point where the outside world came calling. And we'll get to that part in a bit. For now, just imagine a world where the most powerful person is the one who gives the most away, and whose wealth is measured not by what they have, but by what they have done. Every single rice stone, from the largest to the smallest, was more than just a piece of money. It was a living chronicle of its own existence. A mainstream historical fact is that each stone had a unique story, its provenance, its journey, and its ownership history, which was meticulously memorized and passed down through generations. The stone itself was a physical anchor for this narrative, but the true value was in the story. An open historiographic mystery, though, is how the Yopis people were able to maintain such perfect narrative integrity over centuries without any written language. How did they ensure that the story of a specific stone and all its subsequent transactions didn't get muddled or forgotten over time? It was a system that relied on the fallible nature of human memory, yet it worked with remarkable accuracy for hundreds of years. One hypothesis, a deeply compelling one, is that the stories of the rice stones were woven into a form of epic poetry or song, making them easier to remember and more difficult to alter. The rhythm and rhyme of a song, or the structure of a poem, could have acted as a mnemonic device, helping the elders and storytellers to recall every detail. Each transaction, each change of ownership, would be a new verse added to the ongoing saga of the stone. Imagine a bard, a Yapese elder, standing in the village square and singing the history of a particular rice stone. A history that included its perilous journey from Palau, the men who quarried it, the storms it weathered, and the families who have owned it. The entire community would listen, and in doing so, they would all be refreshing their mental ledger. It was a beautiful and practical way to keep their economic history alive and accurate. This narrative-based currency meant that the value of a rice stone was not a fixed number. It was a fluid and dynamic valuation based on its story. A mainstream historical fact is that a stone with a particularly dramatic or challenging history, perhaps one that was lost at sea and later recovered, or one that was involved in a major land dispute and its resolution, would be considered more valuable than a similar-sized stone with a more mundane history. The human element, the story of risk and triumph, was the true measure of its worth. This is a profound concept. In our modern world, we strive for a currency that is predictable and stable, a unit of value that is the same today as it was yesterday. The Yepes, however, embraced the opposite. Their currency was inherently personal and emotional, its value tied to the human experience of its acquisition. The stories of the rice stones were not just economic records. They were a form of cultural identity. The narratives were a way for the Yapese people to connect with their ancestors, to honor the brave men who had risked their lives to bring back these sacred objects. Every time a transaction took place, the story of the stone was retold, and in doing so, the people were reaffirming their shared history and their collective identity. An open historiographic mystery is how the stories of stones that were lost at sea were handled. Did they maintain their value? A hypothesis is that a stone lost at sea, if its story was well known and agreed upon, could still retain its value. Its story of being a lost, heroic piece of wealth would make it even more valuable. Even though it was sitting at the bottom of the ocean, the ownership of the lost stone would be passed down, and it could be used in a transaction, as long as everyone knew that the transaction was for the stone that sank off the coast of Tomil. This is the ultimate proof that the value of the rice stone was never in its physical presence, but in the shared story of its existence. This is a powerful lesson for us today, in a world where we can't even seem to agree on basic facts. The Yapese found a way to agree on the history and value of their currency, not because they had a centralized authority or a physical record, but because they had a shared commitment to a single narrative. The stories of the stones were their truth, their history, and their wealth, all rolled into one beautiful, unbreakable, and very, very heavy package. It's a reminder that money doesn't have to be a cold, impersonal exchange of numbers. It can be a testament to a shared past, a promise of a shared future, and a story that you can tell again and again. It was a perfect system until a man named O'Keefe showed up. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's just sit with the idea of a currency that is also a poem. The rice stones were not merely an economic instrument. They were imbued with profound spiritual and mythological significance, an aspect that gave them a value far beyond their physical mass. This is a mainstream historical fact woven deeply into the Yapese worldview. The stones were believed to be a gift from the gods, a tangible connection to the spiritual realm and the ancestors. This belief system, a tapestry of myths and legends, gave the currency a sacred quality that made it impossible to counterfeit or devalue from within the culture itself. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact nature of these founding myths. We have fragmented accounts from early explorers and anthropologists, but the complete original story remains a guarded piece of Yapese oral history. One leading hypothesis is that the myths explain not only the origin of the stones, but also the origin of Yapese society itself. A common story, for example, tells of a great navigator, perhaps named Fefan, who was guided by a wise chief to the island of Palau in search of a specific perfect stone. The chief had a vision, a dream, in which he saw the stone being shaped by the gods. The journey was not just a quest for wealth, it was a spiritual pilgrimage. The storms they faced were tests of faith, and the safe return was a sign of divine favor. When the stone was finally brought back to Yap, it wasn't just a commodity. It was a vessel for the spirits of the ancestors who had guided the voyage. This made the stones sacred, untouchable, in a way that our modern currency could never be. You can't just print more of them. They had to be acquired through a divinely sanctioned and perilously difficult process. This spiritual connection meant that the rice stones were not kept in a vault or hidden away. They were displayed in the open, often in sacred places within the village. A mainstream historical fact is that they were often placed near men's meeting houses or in specific ceremonial clearings. The stones were part of the landscape, a silent, powerful presence that reminded the community of their origins and their obligations to the ancestors. They were a physical representation of an invisible, spiritual contract. The entire village, in a sense, became a temple, with the Rai stones as its central altar. This public display also served a practical purpose. Since the ownership of the stones was based on oral tradition, their physical presence acted as a constant reminder of their stories and who they belonged to. Every person in the village, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, could point to a stone and tell you its history. The stone's value was also tied to their ability to facilitate spiritual harmony. An open historiographic mystery is how they were used in rituals to appease the spirits or to atone for sins. A hypothesis is that a large rice stone, perhaps one with a particularly heroic or sacred history, might be offered to the gods in times of famine, disease, or conflict. The offering would be a symbolic act of sacrifice, a way of showing the gods that the community was willing to give up its most valuable possessions for the collective good. The stone would be moved to a sacred location, and its ownership would be publicly declared as belonging to the spirits. This would be seen as the ultimate form of appeasement, a way to restore balance and harmony with the spiritual world. The stone itself would remain in place, but its value would now be in its new role as a spiritual offering, a silent prayer carved into a piece of rock. The spiritual and economic functions of the rice stones were inextricably linked. The value of a stone was not just in its size or its rarity, but in its sacredness, its ability to connect the living with the dead, the present with the past. The stones were a physical manifestation of their faith, a testament to their belief that their prosperity was not a matter of luck or chance, but a result of their reverence for their traditions and their ancestors. This is why the arrival of the Europeans and their radically different view of money would be so devastating to the Yippies. The outside world saw the rice stones as nothing more than big, useless rocks. But for the Yippies, they were the heart and soul of their culture, a silent testament to a world where money wasn't just a tool for commerce, but a sacred bond between man and the cosmos. At its core, the rice stone economy was not about the accumulation of physical objects. It was about the cultivation and reinforcement of social bonds. This is a mainstream historical fact, perhaps the most important one to grasp when considering the Yapese system. The stones were a currency of trust, a physical representation of the intangible web of obligations, alliances, and favors that held the society together. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact psychological and social mechanisms that made this system of trust so resilient for so long. We know it worked, but we don't know the precise social pressures and cultural norms that prevented widespread cheating or the breakdown of the oral ledger. One hypothesis is that the system relied on a powerful combination of public knowledge and social shame. Since every transaction involving a rice stone was a public event, a person's reputation was on the line with every use of the currency. To lie about a stone's history or its ownership would be to lose face completely, to be seen as untrustworthy, and to be ostracized from the community. In a small, close-knit society where survival depended on cooperation, This was a more powerful deterrent than any prison sentence or financial penalty. Your wealth was not your own. It was a public trust, and your ability to manage it with honesty and integrity was a reflection of your character. The stones were simply a stage upon which this social drama played out. This concept of shared public wealth meant that the rice stones were not used for personal, private gain. A mainstream historical fact is that they were primarily used for communal purposes, to pay for things that benefited the entire village, like the construction of a new meeting house or the payment of a war tribute. A chief's wealth was not measured by how many stones he owned, but by how effectively he used them to secure the well-being of his people. He was not a hoarder, he was a steward. This is a radically different concept from our modern world, where money is often seen as a tool for personal power and private consumption. For the Yapis, money was a tool for governance, a way to ensure social harmony and collective prosperity. The stones were a constant, visible reminder that a person's value was not in their individual holdings, but in their contribution to the community. The stones also served as a kind of physical memory of past obligations. An open historiographic mystery is how they were used to formalize and track debts and promises without a written contract. A hypothesis is that when a debt was incurred or a promise was made, it would be publicly announced in the presence of a specific rice stone. The stone itself would serve as a kind of silent witness, a physical marker for the intangible agreement. The community would then remember the agreement, and the story of the stone would be updated to include this new piece of its history. This is a system that required a level of collective responsibility that is almost unimaginable today. The entire community was responsible for remembering the debts and promises of its members. They were all, in a sense, co-signers on every deal. The system was also a powerful tool for conflict resolution. Mainstream historical fact is that a rice stone, with its deep and shared history, could be used to settle a land dispute or a tribal conflict. The transfer of the stone would be a public declaration that the dispute was over, and the community would then be obligated to enforce the peace. It was a way to end a conflict with a gesture of profound respect and shared value. It was a physical symbol that said, "We value peace and our shared history more than this dispute." The stone was not just a payment. It was a symbol of reconciliation, a silent promise to move forward. The stones were not just money. They were the very glue that held Yapi society together. They were the physical embodiment of their shared values, their history, and their future. They were a currency of community, and they worked beautifully until the outside world, with its different values, came calling. And when that happened, it would throw the entire system into chaos. But that's a story for another time. For now, just think about what it would feel like to have your wealth literally tied to the trust of your neighbors. What a strange and beautiful world that would be. The secluded paradise of Yap, with its ancient trust-based economy, was fated to encounter a world that operated on an entirely different set of principles. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the first sustained contact with Europeans occurred in the mid-19th century, a meeting that would irrevocably alter the course of Yape's history. These initial encounters were often marked by a mutual fascination and misunderstanding. The Yapers were bewildered by the European obsession with small shiny metals and paper slips, while the Europeans, in turn, were baffled by the Yarpies' use of giant immovable stones as their money. The rice stones, so full of value and meaning to the Yarpies, were seen by the outsiders as nothing more than curious, worthless rocks. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact nature of these early conversations. How did the Yapes try to explain their economic system to the Europeans? And how did the Europeans, with their ingrained capitalist worldview, react? We have no detailed record of these initial cultural clashes. That the Yapes tried to explain the rice stones as a form of social currency, with value derived from shared history and collective effort. They would have pointed to the stories embedded in each stone, the lives lost, the storms weathered, the social bonds forged. But the Europeans, coming from a world of gold standards and commodity-based wealth, would have seen this as a fairy tale, a quaint but primitive belief system. They would have looked at the stones and asked, but what is it worth? How much gold is it equal to? The two sides were not just speaking different languages. They were living in different realities. The Yapes believed that value was created by narrative, while the Europeans believed that value was an inherent property of certain materials. This fundamental incompatibility would be the root of all the trouble to come. The arrival of the Europeans introduced a new form of currency and a new set of values that directly challenged the rice system. Mainstream historical fact is that traders from Europe and America began to visit Yap, offering new goods, iron tools, cloth, and even firearms, in exchange for local resources like copra, dried coconut meat, and sea cucumbers. The Yapes had a choice to make. They could either trade their goods for these new foreign currencies, or they could try to use the rice stones. The problem was that the Europeans didn't want the rice stones. They didn't understand them, and they couldn't use them. This created a dual economy on Yap, a traditional rye-based system for internal transactions, and a new foreign currency-based system for external trade. This is where the initial breakdown began, a slow unraveling of the social fabric. How the Yapes people grappled with this new reality. A hypothesis is that the chiefs and elders initially resisted the introduction of foreign money, trying to maintain the integrity of their traditional system. They would have warned the younger generations about the dangers of abandoning their values for the temporary convenience of foreign goods. But the new tools were so much more efficient. An iron axe could do in a day what a shell tool might take a week to accomplish. The temptation was too great. The younger men, eager to get their hands on these new goods, would have been more willing to engage with the foreign traders, creating a generational divide that weakened the authority of the elders. The first major blow to the rice system came not from a hostile force, but from an opportunistic American, an outcast named David O'Keefe, who would see the stones not as a currency of trust, but as a product to be manufactured. But that's a story for the next section. For now, let's consider the quiet moment before the storm, the moment when the Yapes people, who had built their entire society on the shared story of a stone, first encountered a group of people who couldn't care less about the story, who only cared about the material itself. It was a confrontation not of armies, but of worldviews, a clash between a culture that valued history and a culture that valued efficiency. And as we know, in that particular fight, efficiency tends to win, even if it leaves something beautiful broken in its wake. This was the beginning of the end for the old ways, the first crack in a system that had seemed unbreakable for centuries. The centuries-old self-sustaining world of the Yapis and their rice stones was about to collide with a force it was utterly unprepared for, the outside world. This is a mainstream historical fact that marks the beginning of the end for the pure, unadulterated rice system. The arrival of European and American traders in the 19th century brought with it a different set of values, a different kind of money, and a different way of thinking about wealth. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact moment the Yippies first truly understood the foreign concept of money as a private, portable, and fungible commodity, as opposed to their communal and narrative-based system. There was no single, dramatic event, but a slow, insidious erosion of their values. The initial contact with Western traders was one of mutual confusion. The Yapis saw the foreigners' metal coins and paper money as curious trinkets, perhaps useful for trade, but certainly not as a replacement for their magnificent rice stones. The traders, in turn, saw the rice stones as little more than giant, worthless rocks. This initial misunderstanding created a kind of economic and cultural bubble, where the two systems coexisted for a short time, each oblivious to the other's true nature. But the introduction of Western goods, iron tools, firearms, and liquor began to create new desires and new forms of wealth that the rice stones couldn't easily satisfy. The Yapas could not trade a rice stone for a single piece of iron. The transaction was too small for such a massive symbolic currency. This created a demand for a new, more liquid form of exchange. The arrival of a man named David O'Keefe was a turning point. A mainstream historical fact is that O'Keefe, an Irish-American ship captain, was shipwrecked on Yap in the 1870s and quickly saw an opportunity. He wasn't just a trader. He was a businessman who understood the fundamental principles of supply and demand, and he was about to use that knowledge to disrupt the entire Yapese economy. O'Keefe saw the immense effort required to quarry the stones in Palau and realized he could do it faster and more efficiently. He didn't see a sacred object or a cultural artifact. He saw a resource, and a very profitable one at that. An open historiographic mystery, though, is how O'Keefe managed to convince the Yippies chiefs that he, an outsider, had a legitimate claim to produce their sacred currency. A hypothesis is that he was a master of persuasion, using his Western technology and his understanding of their hierarchy to win over the most powerful chiefs. He likely didn't explain his methods in detail, but simply offered a deal. He would use his iron tools to produce more rice stones, and in exchange, he would receive copra, a dried coconut meat used to produce coconut oil. It seemed like a win-win for the Yapese chiefs, but it was a Faustian bargain. They didn't understand. The use of iron tools by O'Keefe and his crew was a devastating blow to the integrity of the rye economy. A mainstream historical fact is that they could produce in weeks what had taken the Yapes months or even years to quarry by hand. The new rice stones, while physically similar to the old ones, lacked the one thing that gave them their value: the history of human effort and perilous journey. They were a cheap, mass-produced imitation, a form of economic counterfeiting on a massive scale. The Yapes had a choice: They could reject O'Keefe's stones, or they could accept them and devalue their entire system. For a time, they accepted them, and the consequences were immediate and profound. The stones lost their sacredness, their narrative value, and their role as a currency of trust. They became for the first time simply objects of trade, valued by their size and not by their story. O'Keefe had introduced inflation to an economy that had never experienced it. The Yappies were left with a currency that was now a mere shell of its former self, its soul gone, its narrative broken. The man who had given them new wealth had, in a single act of commerce, destroyed the very thing that made their wealth meaningful. The story of David O'Keefe is not just a footnote in Yappies' history. It is a central chapter, a cautionary tale about the clash of economic systems. A mainstream historical fact is that O'Keefe, a shipwrecked opportunist, used his knowledge of Western technology to gain an unparalleled position of power on the island. He wasn't a king in the traditional sense, but he became something far more influential. The sole supplier of the island's most valuable currency. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact psychological process by which the Yapese chiefs came to trust O'Keefe and accept his new, devalued stones. Was it a simple fascination with his iron tools, a desire for more stones with less effort, or a complex negotiation where O'Keefe leveraged their rivalries against each other? A rather cynical one at that, is that O'Keefe's genius was in recognizing the Yapese chief's desire for more power and prestige. In a system where a chief's influence was measured by his ability to distribute wealth, O'Keefe offered a shortcut. He could provide them with larger, more impressive stones with minimal effort. This allowed the chiefs to amass wealth and hold more feasts, and in turn, secure more loyalty from their people without having to send their men on dangerous voyages. It was a trade-off. They sacrificed the integrity of their currency for the immediate political gain of a more impressive stockpile of rye. O'Keefe, in turn, gained an endless supply of copra, which he sold to the German coconut oil industry. It was a perfect business model, one that exploited a cultural blind spot for a short-term profit. The Yappies saw a partnership. O'Keefe saw a monopoly. The most fascinating part of this transaction is the kind of king O'Keefe became. A mainstream historical fact is that he lived like a feudal lord on his own private island, with his own fleet of ships and a small army of Yapese workers. He was a micro-tycoon, a self-made monarch whose power came not from divine right or military conquest, but from his control of the money supply. He didn't need to conquer them. He just needed to make himself indispensable. The Yapes, for their part, adapted to this new reality. They still used the stones for traditional ceremonies, but the value of the stones was now tied to their origin. A rye stone quarried by O'Keefe, even a massive one, was known as Yokof, a term that literally meant O'Keefe's stone. It was a mainstream historical fact that these Yokof stones were considered to be of a lower class than the traditional ones, which were called fee and were valued for their narrative of peril and effort. The Yapese had, in a sense, created a two-tiered monetary system, a sacred, high-value currency for important social exchanges, and a cheaper, mass-produced currency for less significant transactions. This new system, however, was a slow-motion disaster. The inflation that O'Keefe had introduced began to devalue the traditional rye stones, which were a finite and difficult to acquire resource. Why risk your life to bring back a single precious stone when O'Keefe could give you a dozen for a few tons of coconuts? The balance was shifting, and with it, the entire social and economic order of Yap was being disrupted. An open historiographic mystery is how the traditional chiefs, the ones whose power was based on the old system, reacted to this slow-motion cultural and economic coup. Did they try to resist O'Keefe? Were there secret meetings and plots to get rid of him? A hypothesis is that the chiefs were divided. Some saw O'Keefe as a necessary evil, a source of new wealth and technology. Others saw him as a threat to their traditions and their way of life. The conflict was not a physical one. It was an invisible war over the soul of the Yapese economy. O'Keefe, for his part, was a man of his time, an imperialist in a tropical paradise, a man who saw a system he didn't understand and decided to bend it to his will. His story is a perfect microcosm of what was happening all over the world during the colonial period. The clash of a traditional communal economy with a modern individualistic one. And for the Yapese, the result was a loss of their most fundamental value. The belief that a currency's worth comes not from its material, but from its story. The introduction of David O'Keefe's mass-produced rye stones initiated a period of economic hyperinflation and cultural decay that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Yapese society. This is a mainstream historical fact, a direct consequence of a traditional economy colliding with a modern one. The sudden artificial increase in the supply of what was once a rare and precious currency caused a rapid and irreversible devaluation. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent of the social disruption caused by this economic shock. We know it was profound, but the specific stories of how families and clans reacted to this devaluing of their inherited wealth are lost to time. The introduction of O'Keefe's rye stones led to a kind of class warfare. The traditional chiefs, whose power was based on their control of the scarce, narrative-rich rye stones, found their authority challenged by a new class of up-and-coming traders who had made their fortune by exchanging copra with O'Keefe for his cheaply made new stones. This new money, the Yokoff, was seen as dirty money, lacking the honorable history of effort and risk that defined the traditional currency. The younger generation, however, likely saw it as a shortcut to power and wealth, a way to bypass the rigid social hierarchy of their elders. This created a profound generational and social rift, as the old guard tried to maintain the value of their sacred currency, while the new guard embraced the modern, transactional nature of O'Keefe's stones. The very concept of wealth, once a measure of collective effort and shared history, became a measure of individual gain and clever opportunism. The devaluation of the rye stones had a ripple effect across all of Yapese life. A mainstream historical fact is that the stones were used for everything from settling feuds to paying for dowries. When the stones lost their value, so too did the systems they were used to maintain. A dowry paid with a Yokoff stone would not be seen as a true honor. It was a cheap imitation of a sacred tradition. This would have led to family conflicts and a general erosion of trust. The social contract, which was based on the shared understanding of the rye stone's value, was now being questioned at every level. The stones were no longer a symbol of trust. They were a source of conflict. The very thing that had brought the people together for centuries was now driving them apart. An open historiographic mystery is how the Yepes people grappled with the moral and philosophical implications of this change. How did they reconcile the idea that a stone with a heroic, decades-long history of human struggle was now worth less than a new, identical-looking one that was made in a few weeks with a metal chisel? A hypothesis is that they did so by creating a new, separate category for the new stones, the Yokov, and by continuing to revere the old stones, the Foi, for their spiritual and historical value. This created a kind of parallel economy, a dual currency system where the old money was still valued for its social and cultural capital, while the new money was used for purely commercial transactions. It was a kind of a defense mechanism, a way for the culture to protect its most sacred values, while still adapting to the new economic reality. This period was a profound moment of crisis for the Yepes. They were not just losing their money, they were losing their identity. The stones were the very heart of their culture, a testament to their bravery, their ingenuity, and their communal spirit. When the value of the stones was called into question, so too was the value of all the virtues they represented. The rice stones, once a symbol of their unity, became a symbol of their division. The beautiful, trusting system they had built over centuries was slowly being chipped away, not by an invading army, but by the relentless, invisible force of Western capitalism. The sound of O'Keeffe's iron tools was not just carving a new rice stone, it was carving a new and more fragmented future for the people of Yap. The end of this unique narrative-based currency was not a single, sudden event, but a long, slow, and heartbreaking decline. The story of the rice stones entered a new and complex phase with the arrival of the Germans. This is a mainstream historical fact, as Germany's colonial administration took control of Yap in 1899 and, like many colonial powers, immediately sought to impose their own economic and political order. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent of the German administration's misunderstanding of the rice stone economy. Did they genuinely believe they could simply tax the stones as a form of property? Or were they aware of the stones' intangible, narrative-based value and chose to ignore it? We can only hypothesize, but their actions suggest a profound cultural and economic blindness. The Germans, with their rigid bureaucratic mindset, saw the rice stones as a form of physical wealth that could be easily catalogued, counted, and taxed. To them, a giant rock was a giant rock, and it must belong to someone who could pay a tax on it. This is a perfect example of a clash of two diametrically opposed worldviews, one based on physical, quantifiable assets, and the other based on intangible communal trust. The Germans demanded that the Yepes chiefs pay a labor tax, and the chiefs, in a show of passive resistance, simply refused. The German governor, a man named Berg, was baffled. He saw the stones sitting everywhere, but he couldn't get the Yepes to use them to pay their taxes. He saw a system that seemed to have no logical basis, and in a moment of frustration, he made a decision that would become a legendary part of Yepes folklore. In a fit of pique, Governor Berg ordered his men to go and paint a black cross on every single rice stone on the island. The message was clear. If the Yepes would not use their money, then the Germans would use it for them. The stones, in their view, were now stamped with the mark of the German government. But to the Yippies, this act was a testament to the fact that the Germans didn't understand their money at all. The value of the rice stones was not in the physical object, it was in the shared knowledge of its history and ownership. The German cross was an irrelevant detail, a mark on a piece of rock, but not on the invisible ledger of Yippies' trust. The Yippies simply ignored the marks and continued to use the stones as before. The stone's value hadn't changed at all. How the Yippies chiefs, with no formal organization or communication, managed to coordinate this collective act of non-compliance. A hypothesis is that it was not a planned rebellion, but a spontaneous, almost instinctive, refusal to accept a foreign concept of value. It was a silent, peaceful act of resistance, a way of saying, you can put a mark on our rocks, but you cannot put a mark on our minds. The rice stones, which had always been a symbol of their culture, now became a symbol of their defiance. They were a passive tool of resistance, a silent fortress against the encroaching tide of colonial values. The Germans, with their guns and their laws, had no way to combat a system of currency that existed entirely in the collective memory of the people. They could not tax the trust, and they could not confiscate the shared knowledge. The rice stones, by their very nature, were a form of financial sovereignty. The German administration's attempts to impose a Western economic model on Yap were a complete failure. A mainstream historical fact is that they eventually gave up and had to resort to a more traditional system of forced labor and punitive measures. They could not, for the life of them, figure out how to tax a currency that didn't move. The story of the Black Crosses is a powerful testament to the resilience of a culture that understood that true wealth is not in the things you own, but in the trust you share with your community. The rice stones, once a symbol of their communal effort, were now a symbol of their quiet, unyielding resistance to an alien and incomprehensible form of power. They were a silent monument to the enduring strength of tradition in the face of forced change. The Germans had the rocks, but the Yippies had the value. The rice stones, once a currency of social bonds and a testament to human endeavor, evolved during the German colonial period into a subtle and powerful tool of passive resistance. This is a mainstream historical fact, a fascinating turn in the story of this unique currency. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent to which this resistance was a coordinated, conscious strategy, or if it was simply the natural, almost unconscious result of the Yippies people's deeply ingrained cultural values. Did the chiefs meet in secret to plan their defiance, or did they simply react in unison, each knowing what the other would do? Because it was the only logical response within their worldview. One compelling hypothesis is that the Yippies chiefs, in their wisdom, recognized that the most effective way to resist a foreign power was not through armed conflict, which they would surely lose, but through a cultural and economic defiance that the Germans could not comprehend. By refusing to use the rice stones in the German-imposed economy, they were, in effect, withdrawing their most valuable asset from circulation. They were saying, you may have control of our land, but you do not have control of our money. The stones, in this context, became a kind of financial embargo, a silent strike that frustrated the colonial administration's attempts to integrate them into a cash-based system. The Germans' Black Crosses were a physical manifestation of their failed attempt to control an economy that was intangible. The Rice Stones' public, immobile nature made them the perfect tool for this resistance. A mainstream historical fact is that they were in plain sight for all to see, a constant reminder of Ypres sovereignty. The Germans could not confiscate them without a major public act of violence, which would likely have been counterproductive. And even if they did, the stone's value would have remained intact in the collective memory of the people. The Germans could have melted down every single rice stone on the island, and the Yapes would still have remembered which family owned which piece of wealth. The Germans could destroy the physical form, but they could not destroy the value which was based on a shared story. This is a profound lesson in the nature of power. The Germans held physical power, but the Yapes held cultural and economic power, and in this case, the latter proved to be more resilient. The rice stones were used in this period to reinforce traditional social structures and relationships. An open historiographic mystery is whether the Yapes used the stones for a specific public act of defiance that we don't know about. A hypothesis is that a chief might have used a large, valuable rice stone to pay for a communal feast in honor of the ancestors, a public act that would have served to remind the people of their traditions and their strength in the face of foreign occupation. The feast would have been a direct contrast to the German demands for labor and taxes, a way of saying, our true work is for our community and our gods, not for you. The rice stones, which were once a symbol of their communal life, became a symbol of their cultural defiance. They were a silent no to the German yes. The German colonial period was, in a strange way, a moment of reaffirmation for the Yippies. It forced them to defend their values and to recognize the true strength of their system. A mainstream historical fact is that the Germans eventually realized their folly and stopped trying to impose a tax on the rice stones. They understood that you can't tax what you don't understand, and they couldn't force the Yapes to use a currency they no longer respected. The rice stones had won. They had proven that their value was not in the rock itself, but in the collective memory and shared trust of a people who refused to be defined by a foreign power. It was a victory, not of arms, but of mind. And as the Germans left, and the next power arrived, the stones would once again face a new challenge, a far more destructive one. But for a time, they had stood firm, a silent monument to the power of a culture that knew what it was truly worth. The period of German colonial rule on Yap was not the final assault on the rice stone economy. A far more destructive force was on the horizon, the outbreak of World War II. This is a mainstream historical fact that brought a level of violence and disruption to the Pacific that the Yapes had never before experienced. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent of the psychological and cultural trauma the war inflicted upon a people whose entire concept of wealth and value was based on peace, tradition, and the sanctity of their history. The war was the antithesis of everything the rice stones stood for. The Yapes, initially, were just bewildered by the conflict between the Japanese and the Americans, as if two powerful foreign families were fighting over a family heirloom in their living room. The island was a strategic military base for the Japanese, and the American forces in their campaign to retake the Pacific, subjected it to intense aerial bombardment. The very landscape of Yap was being irrevocably altered by a war that had nothing to do with them. The rice stones, which had stood for centuries as silent monuments to peace and prosperity, were suddenly in the line of fire. A mainstream historical fact is that during the bombing campaigns, some rice stones were destroyed or damaged, and many others were used by the Japanese as anchors for their ships or as building materials for their airfields and bunkers. They saw the stones not as money, but as large, convenient pieces of rock. They were literally using Yepi's wealth to build their war machine. The use of the stones as anchors and building materials was a profound act of cultural desecration. An open historiographic mystery is how the Yepes people reacted to this. We have no written record of their grief or their anger. A hypothesis is that they viewed it with a mix of resignation and profound sadness, watching as their history was being literally torn apart and repurposed for a war they didn't understand. The stories of the stones, the perilous journeys, the communal efforts, the settling of feuds, were being erased with a shovel and a bulldozer. The stones were being used for a purpose so antithetical to their original meaning that it must have been a form of spiritual torture for the Yepes. The physical damage was one thing, but the cultural and emotional damage was far greater. The war also introduced the Yapis to a new form of money, one that was completely divorced from any physical or cultural meaning, military scrip, issued by both the Japanese and American forces. A mainstream historical fact is that the Yepes were forced to use this paper money, a currency that was not only meaningless to them, but was also highly inflationary and worthless after the war ended. The Yepes saw their new paper money, and they saw what was happening to their rice stones. The contrast must have been stark. On the one hand, a currency that was a part of their landscape, a symbol of their collective history, was being destroyed. On the other hand, a new, meaningless currency was being forced upon them, a currency that was here today and gone tomorrow. The war was a painful and violent lesson in the impermanence of Western money, a sharp contrast to the enduring legacy of their own stones. When the war finally ended, the Yepes people were left with a shattered landscape and a shattered economy. The stones that had survived were now often in new, strange places, or were chipped and broken from bomb blasts. The stories of the stones now had to include a new, painful chapter of violence and desecration. The war, in a single act, had done what O'Keeffe and the Germans could not. It had physically broken some of the stones. But even then, the Yepes still held on to their traditions. An open historiographic mystery is how they managed to rebuild their oral ledger in the aftermath of such chaos. A hypothesis is that the elders, with their deep knowledge, worked tirelessly to recount the stories of the surviving stones and to create new stories for the ones that were damaged or moved. The war was a test of their resilience, and in the end, their culture and their money had survived, albeit forever changed. Following the devastating disruptions of World War II, the Yepes people faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just their physical infrastructure, but also their cultural and economic identity. This is a mainstream historical fact, a period of profound reevaluation and resilience. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent to which the Yepes elders consciously worked to re-establish the traditional value of the rice stones? Did they have a formal, orchestrated plan to restore the oral ledger? Or was it a more organic, slow process of storytelling and communal recommitment? The elders, the living repositories of Yepi's history, understood that the physical damage to the stones was far less important than the psychological damage to their collective memory. The stones could be chipped or moved, but the stories had to be preserved. They likely initiated a quiet, unofficial campaign to retell the stories of the stones, not just their creation and voyages, but their recent history of survival through the war. They would gather the young people and point to a chipped stone, telling the story of how it survived a bomb blast, or to a stone in a new location, explaining how it had been moved by the Japanese and was still owned by its original family. This was a critical act of cultural conservation, a way of reaffirming that the stone's value was not in their physical perfection, but in their narrative of endurance. The rice stones, which had always been a symbol of their history, now became a symbol of their resilience. They were a testament to the fact that their culture had survived the war, and that their values were stronger than any bomb or bulldozer. The re-establishment of the rice stone system was also a way for the Yapis to reassert their sovereignty in the face of the new American administration. A mainstream historical fact is that the Americans, unlike the Germans, largely left the Yapis and their rice stones alone. They were more focused on geopolitical strategy and military bases than on micromanaging the local economy. This created a space for the Yapis to quietly and effectively rebuild their traditional system. The rice stones were a way of saying without words, "We are a sovereign people with our own values and our own way of life." The stones, which had been a passive tool of resistance against the Germans, were now an active tool of cultural reaffirmation against a new, less intrusive, but still foreign power. The post-war period also saw a reintegration of the surviving rice stones into the social and ceremonial fabric of Yepes life. An open historiographic mystery is how they determined the new value of the damaged stones. Was a chipped stone worth less than an undamaged one? A hypothesis is that a damaged stone, a stone that had survived the war, might have been given a new, unique value. Its story of survival would make it a symbol of strength and resilience, and it might even be considered more valuable for that reason. It's a bit like a piece of art that is damaged but is now more valuable because of its unique history. The stones were no longer just a record of their past. They were a testament to their future. They were a sign that they had not only endured, but had also learned and grown. This period of rebuilding was not a simple return to the past. The Yapis' culture and economy were forever changed by the contact with the outside world. The rice stones were no longer the sole currency, and the Yapis now had to navigate a dual currency system, using both their traditional rye and the foreign currencies introduced by the Americans. But the stones remained the heart of their culture, the one true form of wealth that could not be taken or devalued by an outside force. They were the anchor, the unmovable center of a world in flux. The story of the rice stones after the war is a testament to the power of a people to hold on to their values, to rebuild their past, and to find a new way forward. The stones, which had seen so much, now stood as silent witnesses to a culture that had faced the worst and had not only survived, but had triumphed. Today, the Rai stones are not just historical artifacts. They remain a vibrant, living part of Yapese culture, a testament to the enduring power of tradition in a modern world. This is a mainstream historical fact, a beautiful anomaly in a world increasingly dominated by digital and fiat currencies. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the exact process by which the Apese culture has managed to preserve the sacredness of the stones, while simultaneously navigating the complexities of a globalized, cash-based economy. How do they separate the use of their traditional money from their daily transactions? The Yapes have created a kind of dual currency system. They use the American dollar, the currency of the Federated States of Micronesia, for everyday transactions, buying gas, paying for food at the market, or purchasing goods from the store. But for the most significant and culturally important events, they still turn to the Rai stones. A mainstream historical fact is that the stones are still used for major life events like marriages, land transfers, and the resolution of interclan disputes. The use of a Rai stone in these instances is not just a payment, it is a profound act of cultural reaffirmation, a way of saying that the old ways still hold value and meaning. It is a way of honoring the ancestors and keeping the flame of tradition alive. The Rai stones, which were once a currency of everyday life, are now a currency of legacy. The value of the Rai stones today is still based on their story, not their physical perfection. An open historiographic mystery is how the modern Yapese people continue to maintain this oral ledger in a world of smartphones and the internet. A hypothesis is that the knowledge is still passed down from elder to younger generations, but perhaps with new, modern tools. A family might have a digital record of their stones, a photograph or a short video, but the true value still resides in the story that is told and retold. The stones, in a sense, have become their own historical monuments, their narratives memorized like a family Bible. The digital age has not replaced the oral tradition. It has simply provided new ways to preserve and share it. The stone's immense size and immobility also serve to protect their traditional value. A mainstream historical fact is that you can't exactly pick up a Rai stone and use it to buy a new car. The stones, by their very nature, are a defense against the kind of transactional, materialistic culture that has consumed so much of the modern world. They are a constant physical reminder that some things cannot be bought or sold with a credit card. They are a silent protest against consumerism, a testament to a world where wealth was about trust and community, not about accumulation. The stones are now also a symbol of Yapese identity on the global stage. A mainstream historical fact is that Yap is now a major tourist destination, and the Rai stones are one of its primary attractions. The stones, which were once a source of wealth for the Yapese, are now a source of economic opportunity through tourism. But even in this context, the Yapese have managed to maintain the dignity and sacredness of their money. Tourists can look at the stones, and they can learn their history, but they cannot buy or sell them. The stones are a part of the landscape, but they are still a part of the culture. And the Yapese people are the only ones who can truly understand their value. The stones are a living museum, a testament to a unique economic system that has survived wars, colonialism, and a globalized world, all because the people who created it refused to let go of its most important value, its story. The rice stone's contemporary economic role is a fascinating paradox. While it is no longer the currency of daily commerce, it remains the ultimate form of wealth and value in Yapese culture. This is a mainstream historical fact, a unique example of a traditional currency coexisting with a modern one. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent of the social and psychological impact of this dual currency system. How does a person navigate a world where a giant immovable stone is worth more than a bank account full of cash? How do they reconcile the two very different ways of thinking about wealth? The Yapes have created a cognitive firewall, a mental separation of their lives into two distinct realms, the traditional and the modern. The American dollar is the currency of the modern world, a tool for buying goods, paying bills, and participating in the global economy. The rice stone, on the other hand, is the currency of the traditional world, a tool for maintaining social status, settling disputes, and honoring the ancestors. The two systems rarely, if ever, cross over. You don't pay for gas with a rice stone, and you don't use a credit card to pay for a marriage dowry. This clear separation allows the Yapes to participate in the global economy without sacrificing the core values of their culture. It's a testament to their resilience and their ability to adapt without assimilating. The rice stones are a physical representation of this cultural boundary. A mainstream historical fact is that they are still used today for significant social purposes, such as paying a dowry for a bride, purchasing land, or settling a major inter-clan dispute. In these instances, the value of the stone is not just in its monetary worth, but in its ability to symbolize a promise, a commitment, and a shared history. A land transfer, for example, is not just a commercial transaction. It is a ritualistic act that solidifies a relationship between two families. The use of a rice stone in this context makes the transaction sacred and binding in a way that a simple exchange of cash could never be. The stones, by their very nature, enforce social norms and moral obligations in a way that a legal contract never could. An open historiographic mystery is the exact valuation of a rice stone in today's world. Since the value is not a fixed number, but is based on its history and story, how is a price determined? A hypothesis is that it's still based on negotiation and communal consensus, but with a modern twist. The elders of the community, the keepers of the rice stone histories, would likely act as a kind of appraisal committee, and they would consider not only the stone's physical size, but also its narrative of effort, risk, and triumph. They might take into account a stone's specific history, whether it was used to settle a famous feud or whether it survived a particular storm. And this would all factor into its modern-day value. The rice stones, in a sense, have become a form of narrative-based cryptocurrency, a decentralized system of value that is verified not by a computer algorithm, but by the collective memory of a people. The rice stones, in their contemporary role, are a powerful symbol of a culture that refuses to be defined by the outside world. They are a physical reminder that true wealth is not in the things you own, but in the trust you share with your community. They are a silent protest against a world that values speed and convenience over history and narrative. They are a testament to the fact that money can be more than just a tool for commerce. It can be a vessel for a people's history, their values, and their very soul. The stones, which have survived so much, stand today as a quiet monument to a culture that has found a way to be both in the world and of the world on its own terms. The story of the Rice Stones, once a closed chapter of island history, has now found a strange new life in the digital age. This is a mainstream historical fact, as modern day proposals have emerged to create a digital currency based on the principles of the ancient Yapese money. An open historiographic mystery, however, is whether a digital currency, which is by its very nature intangible and globally accessible, can truly replicate the social trust and communal narrative that gave the Rice Stones their value. Can you digitize a handshake? Can you put a story on a server? The Rice Stones offer a perfect historical analogy for the very nature of a blockchain-based cryptocurrency. A mainstream historical fact is that a blockchain is a decentralized, distributed, and publicly verifiable ledger. The Rice Stones, in their original form, were a physical manifestation of this concept. The community was the distributed ledger, and every person held a mental copy of the history of the stones, which served as the transaction record. When a stone changed hands, the community validated the transaction, making it a new permanent block in their collective memory. The Yapes had, in a sense, a human blockchain for centuries. A digital Rai would simply be a modern-day replica of this system, using code and servers instead of memory and shared stories. The value would be in the token, but the trust would be in the decentralized network of users who validated the transactions. The modern proposals for a digital Rai, however, face a number of fundamental challenges. An open historiographic mystery is how they would incorporate the narrative and social value that gave the stones their true worth. A Rice Stone's value was not just in its existence, but in the human effort and peril that went into its creation. How do you digitize that? A hypothesis is that a digital Rai could incorporate a proof of effort mechanism where the token's value is tied to a real-world, human-centric action, perhaps a public service or a community project. The token would be a reward for a shared effort, and its value would be in the story of its creation, a story that would be forever etched into the blockchain. This would be a way of replicating the Yapes system, where a currency's value is in the social good it creates, not just in its scarcity. The story of the Rice Stones in the digital age is a powerful reminder that the fundamental questions about money have not changed. What gives money its value? Is it a piece of paper, a block of code, or the trust we place in it? The Yapes' answer was clear. The value is in the trust and the story. The Rice Stones were a physical token for a shared promise. A digital Rai would be a digital token for the same promise. The technology may be different, but the principle is the same. The stones, in their silent, unchanging way, are a constant source of inspiration. A reminder that the most revolutionary ideas are often the most ancient. They remind us that the future of money might look a lot like its past. The story of the Rice Stones, particularly its period of turmoil, offers a profound and practical case study for understanding the nature of value and the evolution of a token-based economy. This is a mainstream historical fact, a kind of natural experiment in monetary theory. An open historiographic mystery, however, is whether the Yapese people, in their unique system, had an intuitive understanding of economic principles like inflation and the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic value. or if their reactions were simply an instinctual cultural defense mechanism. Did they know they were fighting hyperinflation, or did they just know they were fighting to preserve their way of life? One compelling hypothesis is that they had an instinctive grasp of these concepts, even if they didn't have the words for them. When David O'Keefe introduced his mass-produced stones, the Yapes recognized that the value of their currency had been fundamentally altered. The value of their original rye, the FV, was not in the limestone itself, but in the narrative of human effort and peril. O'Keefe's stones, the Yokoff, were identical in material and size, but they lacked the essential narrative component. The Yapes, in their wisdom, created a two-tiered system to reflect this. A mainstream historical fact is that they valued the FI for social and ceremonial purposes, and the Yokoff for more mundane transactions. This is the very definition of a store of value versus a medium of exchange, a distinction that modern economists still grapple with. The Yapes had figured out that a currency can have different functions and different values depending on its context and history. The Rye Stone system also offers a powerful lesson on the role of trust in a monetary system. A mainstream historical fact is that the value of the stones was based entirely on the collective memory and communal trust of the Yapese people. When the Germans tried to tax the stones by painting a black cross on them, the Yapese knew that the mark was meaningless. The Germans had marked the physical object, but they had not marked the shared understanding of its value. The Yapes, by refusing to recognize the Germans' authority over their money, were making a profound statement about the true source of a currency's power. It is not the government, the bank, or the piece of paper. It is the people who use it and believe in it. The Rye Stones were a testament to the idea that a currency's value is not a decree from on high, but a social contract among people. An open historiographic mystery is whether this lesson is transferable to our modern, globalized world. Can a society of billions, spread across continents and cultures, ever replicate the kind of communal trust that made the Rye Stone economy work? A hypothesis is that the principles are the same, but the scale is different. The Rye Stones required a small, close-knit community where every member knew every transaction. Our modern currencies, whether fiat or digital, require a much more complex and often anonymous system of trust. The Rye Stones, in their silent and heavy way, remind us that the most successful monetary systems are built not on algorithms or physical materials, but on a shared belief in their value. The stones are a quiet and very heavy reminder that the future of money depends not on what we use, but on whom we trust. The lessons from Yap are not just for anthropologists. They are for all of us. The future of Yapese heritage is inextricably linked to the preservation of the Rye Stones' history and cultural significance. This is a mainstream historical fact, a truth that the Yapese people are keenly aware of as they navigate the modern world. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent of the challenges they face in maintaining this oral history in the face of a rapidly changing global culture. How do they ensure that the younger generations, who are exposed to a world of smartphones, social media, and digital currencies, will continue to value a giant immobile rock? The preservation of the Rye Stones' history is becoming a more conscious and perhaps even a formalized effort. The Yapese elders, the traditional keepers of the oral ledger, maybe working with younger generations to create new ways of documenting and sharing the stories of the stones. This could take the form of digital archives, documentaries, or educational programs in schools. The goal would not be to replace the oral tradition, but to supplement it, to ensure that the stories are not lost to time or to the distractions of the modern world. The Rye Stones, which were once a symbol of their past, are now a symbol of their future, a cultural resource that must be actively managed and protected. The stone's physical presence on the island also serves as a constant, silent reminder of their history. A mainstream historical fact is that you can't go anywhere on Yap without seeing a rice stone. They are in the villages, along the roads, and in the fields. They are a part of the landscape, a physical testament to a culture that has found a way to resist being completely subsumed by the outside world. The stones, in their silent and heavy way, are a form of cultural indoctrination. They are a constant physical lesson that a person's value is not in what they own, but in who they are and where they come from. They are a reminder that a person's worth is in their connection to their community and their ancestors. The preservation of the Rye Stone history is also a way for the Yapis to control their own narrative. An open historiographic mystery is how they navigate the fine line between sharing their culture with the world and protecting its sacredness. A hypothesis is that they have a very clear and distinct separation between their public and private lives. They are willing to share their culture with tourists and with the world, but they keep the most sacred and important parts of their tradition for themselves. The Rye Stones are a part of their public face, but the stories behind them are still a part of their private communal life. The stones are a symbol of their culture, but the true wealth, the true value, is still held in the hearts and minds of the Yapese people themselves. The Rye Stones, in their contemporary role, are a powerful symbol of a culture that has found a way to be both in the world and of the world, on its own terms. They are a testament to the idea that a people can embrace modernity without sacrificing their identity. They are a reminder that the most valuable things in life are not always the things you can buy or sell. They are the connections, the stories, and the shared values that bind a community together. The stones, which have survived so much, stand today as a quiet and very heavy testament to the enduring power of a culture that has found a way to preserve its soul. The Rye Stones are not just a piece of history. They are now a major tourist attraction, providing economic opportunities for the Yapese people while simultaneously posing new challenges for cultural conservation. This is a mainstream historical fact, a fascinating modern chapter in the story of this ancient currency. An open historiographic mystery, however, is the full extent to which the Yapese people feel their culture has been commodified by this influx of tourism. Do they see it as a welcome source of income or as a necessary evil that risks cheapening their most sacred traditions? The Yapes have, with their characteristic wisdom and pragmatism, found a way to manage the flow of tourism in a way that benefits them without fundamentally altering their values. A mainstream historical fact is that tourists are encouraged to visit the villages and see the stones. And a number of local guides and artisans have created a small but thriving economy around this interest. Tourists can buy small, replica Rye stones as souvenirs, and they can learn the history of the real stones from the local guides. This allows the Yapis to monetize their cultural heritage without ever having to sell the real sacred stones. It's a genius form of cultural marketing that maintains the integrity of the original currency. They are selling the story, not the stones themselves. The stone's immense size and immobility also serve as a natural barrier to commercialization. A mainstream historical fact is that you can't exactly put a rice stone in your suitcase and take it home. This physical constraint prevents the kind of rampant commodification that has plagued other ancient cultures. The stones have to stay on Yap, which means that the Yapese people, and only the Yapese people, have control over their destiny. This gives them a profound level of financial and cultural sovereignty. The stones, in their silent and unmoving way, are a constant reminder that their most valuable asset is not for sale. How the Yapese people, in their daily interactions with tourists, manage to reconcile the two very different ways of thinking about money. A hypothesis is that they have a kind of public face and a private face. To the tourists, the stones are a curiosity, a fascinating relic of a bygone era. But to the Yapes, they are still a living currency, a sacred bond between man, community, and the ancestors. They can tell the stories of the stones to the tourists, but they do not share the sacred and private knowledge of the oral ledger. This allows them to be good hosts and to benefit from the tourist economy without ever revealing the true source of their wealth. The stones, in a sense, are the beautiful cover of a book whose most important chapters are only accessible to the initiated. The rice stones, in their role as a tourist attraction, are a powerful symbol of a culture that has found a way to thrive in the modern world without sacrificing its soul. They are a testament to the idea that a people's history and their values can be a source of strength, not just a relic of the past. The stones, which have survived so much, stand today as a quiet and very heavy monument to a culture that has found a way to be both in the world and of the world on its own terms. They are not just money. They are a metaphor for the enduring power of human connection. The story of the rice stones, from their ancient origins to their modern-day use, serves as a powerful metaphor for intangible wealth, communal trust, and the true meaning of value. This is a mainstream historical fact, a philosophical truth that transcends the Yapese culture. An open historiographic mystery, however, is whether a modern, globalized society, with its focus on individualism and consumerism, can ever truly grasp the lessons of the rice stone economy. Can we, as a global community, find a way to build a currency based on shared trust and collective memory? Or are we forever doomed to a system based on physical and digital assets? The rice stones offer a clear and very heavy example of what economists call social capital. Social capital is the value that comes from human connections, from the network of relationships and shared values that hold a society together. The rice stones were not just money. They were a physical representation of this social capital. A mainstream historical fact is that a rice stone was only as valuable as the trust that the community placed in it. Its value was not in its scarcity or its material, but in the shared promise that it represented. The stones were a silent agreement, a communal contract that said, "We believe in this, and we believe in each other." This is a lesson that is more relevant today than ever. In a world where we are increasingly disconnected and our trust in institutions is at an all-time low. The story of O'Keeffe's mass-produced stones is a metaphor for the dangers of a money supply that is not tied to a shared value system. A mainstream historical fact is that when O'Keeffe introduced his cheap, identical stones, he wasn't just introducing inflation, he was introducing a kind of cultural virus, a concept that a currency's value could be divorced from its history and its community. The stones became objects of transaction, not of trust. This is a lesson we are still grappling with today, in a world where financial bubbles and collapses are a regular occurrence. The Rice stones, in their silent and unmoving way, remind us that when we lose the connection between our money and our values, we risk losing everything. Whether our modern attempts at creating new forms of money, like cryptocurrencies, will learn from the Rice stone story. A hypothesis is that a truly successful digital currency will not just be a technological marvel, it will also be a social one. It will be a currency that is not just based on a code or a network, but on a community of people who have a shared purpose and a shared trust. It will be a currency that has a story, a history of its own, a story of human effort and shared creation. The Rice stones, which have survived so much, stand today as a quiet and very heavy testament to the enduring power of a culture that has found a way to preserve its soul. They are a reminder that the most valuable things in life are not always the things you can buy or sell. They are the connections, the stories, and the shared values that bind a community together. The story of the Rice stones, as a symbol of human connection and value, offers a final peaceful reflection. This is a mainstream historical fact, an enduring legacy that stands in silent opposition to the fast-paced, transactional nature of our modern world. An open historiographic mystery, however, is whether the Rice stones will be able to maintain their sacredness in an increasingly secular, globalized world. Will they become mere curiosities for tourists? Or will they continue to be a living, breathing part of Yepi's culture, their narratives passed down through generations? The stones will endure precisely because of their unique nature. They are not portable, they cannot be hidden, and they cannot be faked. They are a physical anchor for a system of value that is based on trust and shared history. A system that is a powerful antidote to the anonymity and instability of the modern financial world. The Rice stones, in their silent and heavy way, remind us that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be bought or sold. They are the connections, the stories, and the shared values that bind a community together. They are a monument to the idea that a currency's true worth is not in its material, but in the people who use it. The stones, as a global metaphor, are a quiet challenge to our own assumptions about money. We believe that money must be portable, that it must be a medium of exchange, and that its value must be determined by a central authority. The Yuppies, for centuries, proved that none of these things were necessary. They built a system of wealth that was based on trust, and they found a way to make a currency that was also a living, breathing history. The stones, in their silent and unmoving way, are a constant reminder that there is more than one way to think about wealth, and that perhaps our way is not the only or even the best way. How the stones will be viewed in the future as the world becomes more and more digital Will the Yapis embrace a digital version of the Rai? And if so, will it retain the same social and narrative value as the physical stones? A hypothesis is that a digital Rai could be a powerful tool for cultural preservation, a way of ensuring that the oral ledger is never lost to time. But it would also be a risk, a way of introducing a level of abstraction that the Yapis have, for centuries, so wisely resisted. The Rai stones, in their final slumber, are a question. They ask us what we truly value, and they challenge us to build a world where our wealth is a reflection of our best selves, a world where our money is a testament to our shared history and our collective trust. They are a quiet and very heavy legacy, overview of the entire narrative of the Rai stones. The story of the Rai stones of Yap is not merely an economic history. It's a profound cultural and philosophical case study. The Rai were not just large, donut-shaped pieces of limestone. Their value was entirely intangible, residing in a collective oral ledger that tracked their history, the human effort in their creation, and their role in social exchanges. This system, based on communal trust and shared narrative, was the very antithesis of modern, portable, and fungible currencies. The Yepu's economic system, which flourished for centuries, faced a devastating challenge with the arrival of Western powers. The first major disruption came from David O'Keefe, an Irish-American opportunist who used iron tools and gunpowder to mass-produce Rai stones, a process that once required months of perilous labor. This act introduced hyperinflation to an economy that had never experienced it. O'Keefe's cheaply made stones, known as Yokoff, lacked the narrative and spiritual value of the traditional Effie stones, leading to a two-tiered monetary system and a breakdown of social cohesion. Despite these challenges, the Rai stones proved to be remarkably resilient. During the German colonial period, the stones became a tool of passive resistance. When the Germans attempted to tax the stones, the Yapis simply refused to use them for foreign-imposed transactions. The German governor's act of painting a black cross on the stones was a testament to his profound misunderstanding of their value, which was not in the physical object, but in the collective memory of the people. The Rai stones had become a symbol of defiance. Today, the Rai stones no longer serve as an everyday currency, but they remain the ultimate form of social and cultural wealth on Yap. They are used for major ceremonies and land transactions, a testament to the enduring power of tradition. The story of the Rai offers a timeless lesson. The true value of a currency lies not in its material, but in the shared trust and story that a community places in it. In a world of digital currencies and financial abstraction, the Rai stones are a quiet and very heavy reminder that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be bought, sold, or even moved. The Rai stones' history is not about a grand battle or a dramatic event. It's about a quiet, enduring presence. The stones, now partially covered in moss and roots, sit in the villages of Yap, silent witnesses to a history that they have not only survived, but have helped to write. They are a final, peaceful reflection on a world where money was not an abstraction, but a physical and spiritual part of life, an open historiographic mystery, and one that we will likely never solve, is what these stones feel or remember. If an object could hold a memory, what would these stones, with their millennia of history, tell us? A hypothesis is that they would speak of the men who risked their lives to bring them from Palau, the families who exchanged them for land and love, the German governor who painted them with a useless black cross, and the American bombs that chipped away at their surface. The Rice Stones' final act is one of silent teaching. They teach us that money doesn't have to be a source of conflict or greed. It can be a source of community and connection. They teach us that true wealth is not in the things you own, but in the stories you share. They teach us that a currency can be a testament to human effort, to shared sacrifice, and to collective trust. Their quiet presence on the island is a constant and very heavy reminder that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be bought or sold. As we end this historical journey together, let's just sit with the image of these great silent stones. They are not just money, they are monuments to a people's enduring spirit. They are a physical anchor for a culture that has found a way to resist being completely subsumed by the modern world. They are a reminder that the world is a strange and beautiful place, full of mysteries and wonders that defy our understanding. And they are finally a gentle whisper, a reminder to seek out the quiet, the enduring, and the things that have a story to tell. Close your eyes now and imagine the feel of the cool, heavy stone, the stories it holds, and the peaceful, sleepy way it has endured. Wishing you a night of deep and peaceful rest.